What is the sound of humiliation? Is it the hushed whispers of a crowd, the frantic beat of your own heart? Or is it something sharper? For David Henderson, a brilliant architect on the most important trip of his life, it was the sound of paper tearing, a crisp, deliberate rip that echoed louder than a gunshot in the sterile silence of the departure lounge. His boarding pass, his key to a life-changing opportunity, was torn in two by a flight attendant with ice in her veins. Little did she know the quiet man in the corner, the one she'd ignored just moments before, was about to tear her entire world apart. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 hummed with a unique blend of anxiety and excitement. It was a symphony of rolling luggage wheels, multilingual announcements, and the faint, comforting scent of coffee and jet fuel. For David Henderson, it was the overture to the most important performance of his life. At 42, David had the kind of quiet confidence that came not from privilege, but from persistence. He was a senior partner at a prestigious New York architectural firm, a position he had carved out for himself through sheer talent and a work ethic that bordered on relentless. His suit, a tailored navy wool, was immaculate. His leather briefcase held not just his laptop and documents, but the culmination of a 2-year dream, the final pitch for the new Dubai Museum of the Future. This wasn't just another skyscraper. It was a legacy project. A chance to build something that would outlast him, a landmark that his 10-year-old daughter Maya could one day point to and say, "My dad built that." He'd kissed Maya and his wife Sarah goodbye that morning, the weight of their belief in him, a warm, steadying presence. "Just be you, David," Sarah had said, her hand on his cheek. "They'll see what I see." He navigated through the bustling terminal, towards the Virgin Atlantic gate for Flight 104 to London Heathrow, the first leg of his journey. He believed in flying with airlines that had a reputation for quality service. It was part of his philosophy: you invest in quality, you get quality. The boarding queue was a microcosm of the world business, travelers like himself. Families buzzing with vacation energy students with oversized backpacks. David found his place in the priority line, his upper-class ticket a small but significant perk of his senior position. That's when he first saw her. Her name, according to the silver tag pinned to her crisp red uniform, was Caroline Miller. She was the senior purser, commanding the gate with an air of weary authority. She had sharp, angular features, blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a thin, disapproving line. She moved with a clipped efficiency, her eyes scanning the passengers not as customers, but as potential problems. David watched her interact with a young couple ahead of him, whose carry-on bag was a fraction of an inch too large for the sizer. Caroline's voice was laced with a condescending sweetness. "I understand you think it fits, but the rules are the rules for a reason," she said, her smile never reaching her cold blue eyes. The couple, flustered and embarrassed, were forced to step aside and frantically repack their belongings on the terminal floor. David felt a familiar low-level thrum of unease. He'd seen this type of person before, individuals who wielded their small measure of power like a weapon, finding satisfaction in the enforcement of rules rather than the spirit of service. He took a steadying breath, reminding himself to remain calm, polite, and professional no matter what. He was a guest in this process, and his only goal was to get to London. "Next," Caroline called out, her voice sharp. David stepped forward, placing his carry-on roller bag on the scale and holding out his passport and boarding pass. He offered a polite, closed-mouth smile. "Good afternoon." Caroline didn't return the greeting. Her eyes flickered from his face to his suit to his expensive watch, and a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in her expression. It was a flicker of something. Resentment. Disbelief. "Place your bag in the sizer," she commanded, not looking at him. Her attention already on her computer screen. David obliged. The bag, which he had used dozens of times on this very airline, slid in perfectly. He was meticulous about these things. "It seems to be fine," he said calmly. Caroline finally looked up, her gaze lingering on him. Let me see your ticket again." He handed her the boarding pass. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his, and he could feel a strange cold energy from her touch. She stared at the paper as if trying to find a flaw in the ink itself. She scanned it. The machine beeped green. Everything was in order. Still, she held on to it. "There seems to be a flag on your reservation," she said, her tone suggesting he was personally responsible for a global computer glitch. David's heart rate ticked up a notch. "A flag. I confirmed my flight this morning. Is there a problem?" "I'm looking into it," she snapped, typing furiously. The line behind David was growing the collective sigh of impatient travelers, a tangible pressure. "You were randomly selected for additional security screening. We need to verify your identity and payment method again." David knew this was nonsense. Additional screening happened at security, not at the gate after the fact, and his ticket had already been accepted. He was being singled out. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, a mix of pity and annoyance, but he kept his composure. Years of navigating corporate boardrooms and subtle prejudices had taught him that the moment you lose your cool, you lose. "Of course," David said, his voice even. "I have my driver's license and the credit card I used to book the ticket right here." He reached into his jacket, but Caroline held up a hand, stopping him. "This is going to take some time. Please step to the side. I need to keep the line moving." Her words were dismissive, her gesture a public shooing. She was treating him not like a premium passenger with a minor issue, but like a problem to be contained. David stood his ground, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its firmness. "With all due respect," he began, "my flight is boarding and my ticket has been scanned and approved. If there's a specific document you need to see, I am happy to provide it right now. I'd prefer not to step aside." Caroline's mask of professional indifference cracked. A flash of raw anger lit her eyes. To her, this was defiance. This black man in his fancy suit wasn't being compliant. He wasn't cowering. He was questioning her authority. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with venomous politeness, "you will step aside now, or I will have you removed from this flight for being non-compliant." The confrontation had escalated in seconds. The whispers behind him grew louder. David knew he was at a crossroads. He could submit to the humiliation and risk missing his flight, or he could stand up for his dignity. He chose dignity. "I'm not being non-compliant," he stated clearly, his voice resonating with authority. "I'm a paying customer in upper class, asking for clarification on a problem you've just invented. I would like to speak to your supervisor." Caroline let out a short, incredulous laugh. "My supervisor, honey. I am the supervisor." She leaned in closer, her voice a low hiss meant only for him. "And people like you don't get to make demands here. You follow the rules, or you don't fly. It's that simple." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air between them, a toxic cloud. It confirmed everything David had suspected. This wasn't about a bag or a flag in the system. This was about him, about the color of his skin packaged in a suit she felt he had no right to wear. And as David prepared to respond, to hold a mirror up to the ugliness she had just revealed, Caroline Miller did the unthinkable. With a look of pure, unadulterated spite, she took his boarding pass in both hands, and with a sharp, violent motion, she tore it directly in half. Rape. The sound was shockingly intimate, a visceral tearing of fibre and ink that sliced through the terminal's ambient hum. For a moment, a profound and absolute silence fell over Gate 24. Every eye was locked on the 2 pieces of paper fluttering in Caroline Miller's hand. David Henderson stared, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. It was so juvenile, so utterly unprofessional that it felt surreal. He had been prepared for arguments, for security calls, for being denied boarding. He had never, in all his years of travel, conceived of this. A physical destruction of his right to be there. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was his dignity, his professionalism, his identity as a legitimate traveler, torn asunder in front of 100 strangers. The 2 halves of his boarding pass settled in her palm. Caroline's chest was heaving slightly, her face flushed with a triumphant, righteous fury. She had done it. She had put the defiant man in his place. She had won. But the silence that followed wasn't the silence of approval. It was the heavy, condemning silence of shock. The young couple she had berated earlier stared with wide, horrified eyes. An elderly woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A businessman in the adjacent line slowly shook his head in disbelief. David felt a cold rage begin to build in his chest, a white-hot furnace threatening to overwhelm the careful composure he had maintained his entire life. But he fought it back. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that if he yelled, if he so much as raised his voice, he would be the one security dragged away. He would be labeled the aggressive black man, and the narrative would be forever twisted against him. Caroline had not just torn his ticket, she had set a trap. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the air into his tight lungs. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and unwavering. "You had no right to do that," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. A flicker of doubt, the first tiny crack in her armor of self-righteousness, appeared in Caroline's eyes. The reaction from the crowd was not what she had expected. There were no nods of agreement, only stares of condemnation. She had overplayed her hand, and in the sudden ringing silence, she seemed to realize it. But it was too late to back down. Pride and prejudice demanded she double down. "You were being disruptive and non-compliant," she declared, her voice a little too loud, a little too defensive. She tossed the 2 pieces of paper onto the counter. "This ticket is now void. I am denying you boarding. The Port Authority is on their way to escort you from the gate." She reached for her radio, her hand trembling slightly. This was it, the final irreversible step. "Disruptive!" A woman's voice cut through the tension. It was the elderly lady who had gasped. She had a kind face now, etched with disapproval. "Excuse me, miss, but that man wasn't being disruptive at all. He was perfectly polite. You were the one being aggressive." "Ma'am, this is an airline security matter," Caroline snapped, turning on the woman. "Please stay out of it." "I won't stay out of it," another voice chimed in. It was a young man in a hoodie, holding up his phone. "I've been recording this whole thing. She's right. He was calm. You've been targeting him from the second he stepped up here." Panic began to bubble beneath Caroline's icy exterior. The situation was spiraling out of her control. The passengers, her audience, had turned against her. She fumbled with her radio. "I need the Port Authority at Gate 24 immediately. We have a hostile passenger." Hostile passenger. The words were a final, desperate attempt to paint David as the villain. David closed his eyes for a brief second. This was how it happened. A career, a reputation, a life-changing opportunity, all could be undone in a moment by a false accusation born of pure malice. His mind raced. The Dubai pitch was in 2 days. He would miss his connecting flight. The entire project, 2 years of his life's best work, was about to go up in smoke because of this woman's bigotry. As 2 Port Authority officers began to stride purposefully towards the gate, a sense of grim resignation washed over David. He had done everything right, and it still hadn't been enough. Just as the officers arrived, a quiet voice from the side of the boarding area spoke, cutting through the drama. "Excuse me." The voice was calm with a distinctive British accent. It wasn't loud, but it had a natural authority that made people turn. David glanced over. Standing near the front of the priority line, a place he had been watching from the entire time, was a man who looked to be in his late 60s or early 70s. He had a weathered, friendly face, a neatly trimmed grey goatee and beard, and kind, crinkling eyes. He was dressed in a way that defied easy categorization: a pair of simple jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a well-worn leather jacket. He looked more like a tourist than a high-powered executive. Caroline, seeing only another interfering passenger, was in no mood. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is an official situation." The man took a calm step forward, his eyes not on Caroline, but on the 2 halves of David's boarding pass sitting on the counter. He looked at them, then up at David's face, a deep line of concern creasing his brow. He then turned his gaze to Caroline. "I think I can help resolve this," the man said politely. "My name is Richard." Caroline's patience was gone. "I don't care if your name is Jesus Christ himself, you are not getting involved. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at David, "is a security risk." The 2 Port Authority officers had now reached the counter, their hands resting near their belts. "What's the situation here, miss?" one of them asked. This passenger was causing a disturbance and refused to comply with airline regulations. "I've denied him boarding," Caroline said, puffing out her chest, her authority seemingly restored by the presence of law enforcement. The man named Richard sighed a soft, disappointed sound. He looked directly at Caroline, his friendly demeanor vanishing, replaced by a gaze of startling intensity. "You tore a customer's ticket in half?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "An upper-class customer who, from my perspective, has been nothing but composed in the face of extreme provocation." Caroline scoffed. "You don't know the situation, sir. Now please stand aside." "Oh, I think I do," the man said, taking another step forward until he was right at the counter. He looked at her name tag, then met her eyes. The entire gate area had fallen silent again, sensing a shift in the power dynamic. "You are Caroline Miller," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "You've been with the company for, 12 years, based out of Heathrow. Senior purser for the last 4. You have 2 commendations for service, but you also have 3 formal complaints lodged against you by passengers in the last 18 months. All of them, interestingly enough, were people of color." Caroline's face went white. The blood drained from it so fast, she looked like a ghost in a red uniform. How could this random passenger know that her employment file was confidential? Who are you?" she stammered, the bravado completely gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The man gave a small, sad smile. He extended a hand towards the bewildered gate agent, standing beside Caroline. "Richard Branson," he said, his voice now clear and unmistakable. founder and president of Virgin Group. And I believe you are working for my airline." The name dropped into the charged atmosphere of the gate like a boulder into a still pond. Richard Branson. For a few seconds the name just hung there, suspended in disbelief. The Port Authority officers exchanged confused glances. The passengers whispered amongst themselves. Caroline Miller's brain, however, processed it instantly. The face once an anonymous, craggy visage sharpened into the globally recognized features of the maverick billionaire. The casual jeans and leather jacket were not the attire of a tourist. They were the signature uniform of a man who owned the very plane she was supposed to be staffing. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The entire foundation of her reality, at that moment, her authority, her righteousness, her control crumbled into dust. She was standing there having just committed an act of gross misconduct, directly in front of the one man on earth who held her entire professional life in the palm of his hand. Branson didn't wait for her to recover. He turned his attention completely to David, his expression one of profound and sincere apology. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice warm and respectful. He must have read the name from the torn boarding pass. "On behalf of Virgin Atlantic, and from me personally, I am deeply and truly sorry. No one, absolutely no one, should be treated this way. Not on our airline. Not anywhere." David, who had been steeling himself for an arrest, was momentarily stunned. He simply nodded, unable to formulate a response. Branson then turned to the Port Authority officers. "Gentlemen, thank you for your prompt response, but your services are no longer required. There are no hostile passengers here. There is only one failure of my staff, a very, very serious failure." The officers, recognizing Branson and understanding they had walked into a corporate firestorm of epic proportions, were more than happy to retreat. "Understood, Mr. Branson," one of them said, and they melted back into the terminal crowd. With the immediate threat gone, Branson's focus returned laser-like to Carolyn. His voice was no longer warm. It was quiet, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man about to perform a necessary but unpleasant amputation. "Caroline," he began, and she flinched as if he had struck her. "You are to hand over your company ID and your duties to the junior purser immediately. You will not be boarding this flight. You will not be working any flight, in fact, until a full investigation has been completed. A meeting will be scheduled with you, Human Resources, and myself within the next 48 hours. Is that understood?" Tears began to well in Caroline's eyes. Not tears of remorse, but tears of panic and self-pity. "Sir, Mr. Branson, you don't understand. He was being difficult. The rules." "I understand perfectly." Branson cut her off, his voice sharp. "I was standing right here. I saw a man who was composed and a staff member who was abusive. You used the phrase, 'people like you.' You manufactured a problem where none existed, and then you destroyed company property. Because that boarding pass, Miss Miller, is our contract with our customer, in an act of public humiliation." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior. Zero. Tolerance. You have not only failed as a representative of this airline, you have failed as a decent human being." He then looked past her to the younger gate agent, a man named Liam, whose face was a mask of terror. "Liam, please print Mr. Henderson a new boarding pass for seat 1A in our upper-class cabin. And could you please find a way to get his checked luggage tagged for priority retrieval? He's had a difficult enough day." "Yes, sir." "Of course, Mr. Branson." Liam scrambled to the computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as if his life depended on it. Caroline stood frozen, a statue of disgrace. The other passengers were now openly staring, some with their phones still raised. The young man who had been recording gave David a discreet thumbs up. Branson wasn't finished. He took the two halves of the torn ticket from the counter and held them up. "This," he said, his voice rising so everyone in the vicinity could hear, "is not what Virgin Atlantic stands for. We connect people. We don't tear them down. We fly on principles of service, respect, and fun. There is no room for prejudice, for cruelty, for this kind of ugliness on our watch." He then looked directly at Caroline one last time. "Go home, Caroline. Wait for our call." It was a dismissal, final and absolute. With trembling hands, Caroline unclipped her ID badge from her uniform. Her movements were stiff, robotic. She placed it on the counter without a word. The silver wings that had been her pride, the symbol of her career and identity for over a decade, now seemed to mock her. She turned her face a blotchy mess of tears and shame, and walked away from the gate. She didn't look back. The stares of the 100 passengers followed her like daggers, a silent, damning verdict on her actions. As she disappeared into the crowd, a smattering of applause broke out around the gate. Branson turned back to David, his gentle demeanor returning. Liam handed him the freshly printed boarding pass. "Mr. Henderson," Branson said, offering the ticket. "Again, my deepest apologies. I would be honored if you would allow me to personally escort you onto the plane." David finally found his voice. He took the new boarding pass, the crisp paper, a stark contrast to the mangled pieces that had caused so much pain. "Thank you, Mr. Branson," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." It was all he could manage. The architect, the master of plans and presentations, was at a loss for words, overwhelmed by the dizzying turn of events. One moment he was facing public humiliation and the ruin of his career. The next he was being personally escorted by the founder of the airline. Justice, it turned out, could be as swift and unexpected as the injustice that preceded it. Walking down the jet bridge with Richard Branson was a surreal experience. The low hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit vibrated through the floor, a sound that usually signaled the start of an anonymous journey. But this was different. The furtive glances and whispers from the other passengers boarding ahead of them made David feel like he was in a movie. He was no longer David Henderson, architect. He was the man from the gate. Branson seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on David. "I really am sorry you had to be the one to expose such a flaw in our system, David," he said, using his first name with a natural ease. "It's my name on the side of this plane. When a member of my team behaves that way, it's a personal failure. We hire for personality, for warmth. That was the opposite of everything we stand for." "I appreciate you stepping in," David replied honestly. "I'm not sure how that would have ended otherwise." "I do," Branson said grimly, "and it's not a picture I like to contemplate." They reached the aircraft door. The cabin crew, already alerted to the situation, stood at attention, their professional smiles tinged with a palpable nervousness. The acting purser, a woman named Chloe, who had taken over for Caroline, greeted them. "Mr. Branson, Mr. Henderson, welcome aboard. Please let me show you to your seat 1A. The upper-class cabin was an oasis of calm and luxury. David settled into the plush leather seat that converted into a fully flat bed. It was a world away from the tense, hostile environment of the gate. A flight attendant immediately appeared, offering him a glass of champagne. "Get Mr. Henderson anything he wants," Branson instructed the crew. "The entire contents of this aircraft are at his disposal." And Chloe, please convey to the flight deck that they are to wait for me. It'll be a few more minutes." Branson then turned back to David, leaning against the bulkhead in a casual manner that belied the seriousness of the situation. "Look, I know this is the last thing you want to deal with right now, but this isn't over. We will be conducting a full and thorough investigation. That employee's actions are grounds for immediate termination, but we have to follow procedure. Statements will be taken. That young man who was filming my assistant is getting his contact details as we speak. We will build an airtight case." "What will happen to her?" David asked, a surprising knot of something other than anger in his stomach. It wasn't pity, not exactly, but a somber recognition of a life just professionally immolated. Branson's expression was pragmatic. "She will never work for Virgin Atlantic again. I will personally see to that. And frankly, with the number of witnesses and the video evidence that is likely already making its way online, I doubt she will work for any major airline again. The industry is smaller than you think. A reputation for that kind of behavior, especially now, is a career death sentence." He let that sink in before continuing. "But that's my problem, not yours. Your problem was getting to London for what I assume is an important trip. We're going to make sure that happens as smoothly as possible from here on out." He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. It was simple, elegant, with just his name, a phone number, and an email address. "This is my personal mobile number. Not my assistant's, not an office line. Mine. When you land in London, a car will be waiting for you on us to take you wherever you need to go. If you need anything at all during your stay reservations, transport anything you call that number. And when you return, your entire round trip, of course, will be refunded." David looked at the card. It felt like a tangible apology, a symbol of a wrong being righted. "That's very generous," David said. "Thank you." "It's not generous, it's necessary," Branson corrected him. He then hesitated for a moment, his expression turning more personal. "You handled yourself with incredible grace back there. I've seen executives worth billions crumble under a fraction of that pressure. You stood your ground without losing your dignity. That's a rare quality." Coming from a man like Richard Branson, the compliment landed with significant weight. "I've had practice," David admitted quietly. Branson nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. "I imagine you have, and I'm sorry for that too." With a final handshake, Branson left him to settle in. "Enjoy the flight, David. You've certainly earned it." As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, David leaned back and closed his eyes. The champagne flute was cool in his hand. The engine spooled up with a powerful rising whine, a sound of escape. He was physically leaving the scene, but the emotional residue lingered. The anger was still there, a hot coal in his gut. But it was now joined by a profound sense of vindication. He thought of Maya and Sarah. He would call them when he landed. He would have to explain what happened, and the thought of recounting the humiliation, even with its triumphant ending, was exhausting. He took a sip of champagne. It tasted like victory, but with a bitter aftertaste. The flight to London was by any objective measure perfect. The crew treated him with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. Chloe, the new purser, checked on him personally every hour. The food was exquisite, the wine was vintage, and the flatbed was more comfortable than his couch at home. He tried to work on his presentation, but his mind kept replaying the scene at the gate. The rip of the paper, Caroline's hateful sneer, Branson's sudden appearance. He realized this was no longer just a business trip. The incident had changed something. It had forced a confrontation he never sought, but had handled with a fortitude he didn't know he possessed. The world had tested him, and he had not broken. More than that, the world had for once responded with immediate and unequivocal justice. It was a rare and powerful thing to witness. As the aircraft began its descent into the sprawling lights of London, David looked out the window. He was flying towards his future, towards the Dubai project that meant so much. But he was also flying away from an event that would forever be a part of his story. The torn ticket was a scar, but the way it had been stitched back together by an unexpected ally had turned it into a badge of honor. He had faced down ugliness and had not only survived, but prevailed. And he had a feeling the consequences of that afternoon were far from over, not just for him, but for Caroline Miller as well. For Caroline Miller, the walk from Gate 24 was the longest journey of her life. The usual cacophony of the airport, the announcements, the rolling bags, the chatter seemed to fade into a dull roar, replaced by the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. Every glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. Every uniformed airline employee she passed seemed to be staring at her, their faces a mixture of confusion and contempt. The story she knew would be spreading through the terminal's staff network like wildfire. Caroline Miller tore up a passenger's ticket in front of Branson. By the time she reached the employee parking lot, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in her car's ignition. She collapsed into the driver's seat of her modest Honda Civic and finally let out the sob that had been clawing at her throat. It was a dry, ragged sound, born of pure, unadulterated panic. The drive back to her small one-bedroom apartment in Queens was a blur. Her mind raced, replaying the scene over and over, trying to find a different path she could have taken, a moment where she could have de-escalated instead of doubling down. But her pride, her ingrained sense of authority, had refused to let her. The man Mr. Henderson had been so calm, so infuriatingly composed. His expensive suit, his confident manner, it had triggered something ugly inside her. A deep-seated resentment for people who seemed to have it all, who moved through the world with an ease she had never known. She had worked for 12 years to earn her silver wings, her senior title. She had sacrificed holidays, relationships, and sleep for this job. It was her identity, and she had just set it on fire in a 5-minute blaze of bigotry and bad judgment. Her apartment felt cold and silent when she entered. The framed photos on her wall of her, smiling in her crisp uniform in various exotic locations, now seemed like relics from another person's life. She sank onto her beige sofa, the silence pressing in on her. Her first call was to her union representative, a man named George. His voice, usually bluff and reassuring, was strained. "Caroline," he said, "the lack of pleasantries is a bad sign. I've already had 3 calls about it. 1 from management, 2 from the crew who were at the gate. What in God's name were you thinking? George, he was being impossible," she cried, the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. "He was questioning my authority. He refused to step aside. He was creating a scene." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Caroline, I've seen a video. A passenger sent it to a friend who works for Delta, who sent it to me. The video doesn't show that. It shows a man standing calmly while you berate him. It shows you tearing his ticket, and it shows Sir Richard Branson witnessing the whole thing." The word video hit her like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. "A video. It's already on Twitter," George said, his voice heavy with resignation. #airline Karen Hout Virgin Nightmare. Caroline, this is bad. This is as bad as it gets." "But the union," she stammered. You have to protect me. We will ensure procedure is followed. George said, his tone now formal and distant. You'll have representation at the disciplinary hearing, but I need you to be realistic. Tearing a passenger's boarding pass is a cardinal sin. Doing it in front of the company's founder, I've never heard of anything like it. Start preparing yourself, Caroline. This isn't going to go the way you want. The call ended, leaving Caroline in a deeper state of shock. She numbly opened her laptop and typed her own name into the Twitter search bar. There it was, a shaky 45-second video filmed from the side. It was all there, all. Her condescending tone. Her "people like you" comment just audible over the background noise. And the rip. The horrible, definitive rip. It had over 1 million views. The comments were a tidal wave of vitriol. Fire her immediately, so racist flight attendant. I hope she never works again. They were dissecting her face, her uniform, her very being. In the anonymous, brutal court of public opinion, she had been tried and convicted in under an hour. The next 48 hours were a living hell. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications and calls from numbers she didn't recognize, reporters she assumed. She unplugged it. She drew the blinds and sat in the semi-darkness, the glow of her laptop the only light. The video was everywhere now, picked up by news outlets, tabloid websites, and morning talk shows. Her face was plastered across the internet, a symbol of corporate racism and customer service gone horribly wrong. The official email arrived on the second day, a summons to a meeting at Virgin's corporate headquarters in Manhattan the following morning. The subject line was chillingly sterile: formal disciplinary hearing. Caroline spent the night staring at her ceiling, a slideshow of her life playing in her mind. Her first training flight, the pride in her parents' eyes when she got her wings, the camaraderie with her crew, the small moments of kindness she had shown over the years, calming a nervous flyer, helping a mother with a crying baby. None of that mattered now. Her entire career, her whole identity had been erased and replaced by a 45-second video clip. She had done this to herself. Deep down, past the layers of denial and self-pity, she knew it. The stress of her recent divorce, the mounting credit card debt, the fear of being downsized, none of it was an excuse. It was just the dry kindling. Her own prejudice had been the match. She had seen a successful black man, and on some subconscious level decided he didn't belong. She had challenged him, expecting him to fold. When he didn't, her frustration had boiled over into an act of petty, self-destructive rage. The next morning she put on her most professional suit, a charcoal grey ensemble that felt like a costume for a role she no longer had the right to play. She rode the subway into the city, her head down a scarf pulled high over her face, terrified someone would recognize her. The Virgin office was sleek and modern, a world of glass and steel and cheerful red accents that felt deeply mocking. She was led to a large boardroom. On one side of a long mahogany table sat 3 people, the head of HR, the senior vice president of in-flight services, and her union rep, George, who wouldn't meet her eye. At the head of the table, in the largest chair, sat Sir Richard Branson. He wasn't smiling. The boardroom was unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the gentle hum of the building's climate control system. Caroline Miller sat opposite the panel of executives, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. George, her union rep, sat beside her, his briefcase open, but his posture radiating defeat. Richard Branson began, his voice calm and measured, which was somehow more intimidating than if he had been shouting. "Miss Miller," he said, "we are here to discuss the events of 2 days ago at JFK's Gate 24. This is a formal disciplinary hearing. You will have an opportunity to speak, but first we are going to review the evidence we have gathered. The senior VP of in-flight services, a stern woman named Eleanor Vance, gestured to a large screen on the wall. First, the passenger's account. She read a statement David Henderson had emailed upon request. It was a factual, unemotional recounting of the events from Caroline's initial hostility to the tearing of the ticket. It was precise, detailed, and utterly damning in its clarity. Next, Eleanor played a compilation of audio statements from 4 other passengers and 2 fellow crew members, including Liam, the gate agent. Each one corroborated David's story. They used words like aggressive, condescending, hostile, and unprovoked to describe Caroline's behavior. They described David as calm, polite, and professional. Caroline felt herself shrinking in her chair. Each statement was another nail in her professional coffin. And finally, Eleanor said, her voice grim, "We have this." The video from Twitter filled the screen. It was even worse on a 70-inch display. The audio was clear. Her own voice, dripping with malice, echoed through the silent room. "People like you don't get to make demands here." Then came the rip, loud and sharp. The video ended with the shocked faces of the onlookers. The screen went black. Branson let the silence sit for a full minute, the weight of the evidence pressing down on Caroline until she felt she could barely breathe. "Caroline," he said, finally, his eyes locking onto hers. "In the face of this overwhelming evidence, do you have anything you wish to say in your defense?" This was her one chance. George had coached her. Apologize. Show remorse. Plead stress. Throw herself at their mercy. Her voice trembled as she began. "Sir, Mr. Branson, I am so deeply ashamed. I don't know what came over me. I've been under an immense amount of personal stress lately. My divorce and financial problems. I wasn't myself. I let the pressure get to me. It was a lapse in judgment, a terrible, terrible mistake. It is not who I am." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I have given 12 years of my life to this airline. I have loved this job. Please, please don't let one mistake, one awful 5-minute period destroy my entire career. I will do anything. I'll take a suspension without pay. I'll go through any retraining program you want. I am so sorry." Branson listened patiently until she was finished. He didn't seem moved. "Stress is a factor in many of our employees' lives, Caroline," he said, his voice still level. "We have resources for that. A wellness program, confidential counseling. You availed yourself of none of them. Instead, you chose to channel your stress into an act of aggression against a customer. And this wasn't just a customer. This was a man you racially profiled." "No," Caroline protested a little too quickly. "It wasn't about race. It was his attitude." Branson held up a hand, silencing her. Was it his attitude when he calmly stepped forward and said, "Good afternoon"? Was it his attitude when his bag fit perfectly into the sizer? Or was it the attitude of a black man in a first-class suit who didn't bow and scrape when you decided to exert your authority over him? Your use of the phrase, "people like you," was not ambiguous. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You see, Caroline, this isn't about a single lapse in judgment. The investigation brought up the 3 prior complaints. A Muslim family you accused of loitering near the galley. A Hispanic businessman you insisted had a fake ID. A pattern emerges. A pattern of you abusing your authority with minorities. We as a company failed by not seeing this pattern sooner and acting on it. That failure is on us. But the actions at JFK, they are entirely on you." George, the union rep, cleared his throat. "Sir Richard Caroline has had a long and otherwise satisfactory service record. The union believes termination is an excessive response. A final warning and mandatory diversity training would be more appropriate." "No," Branson said, his voice like iron. "Not this time, George. The line has been crossed. What if I hadn't been there? Mr. Henderson would have been escorted out by police. He would have missed his flight. His career could have been damaged. He could have been arrested, all based on her malicious lies. The potential damage you could have inflicted on that man's life is incalculable." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Caroline Miller, your employment with Virgin Atlantic is terminated effective immediately. Your final pay will be mailed to you. Your flight benefits are revoked. You will be escorted from the building." It was done. 12 years gone in an instant. "Furthermore," Branson added, as a final crushing blow, "our legal team will be reviewing this incident while Mr. Henderson has graciously indicated he does not wish to press charges. The company reserves the right to pursue you for damages related to the harm done to our brand and reputation." Caroline felt a wave of dizziness. They were going to sue her. She was speechless. Tears streamed down her face as a security guard entered the room. It was all over. Her career, her identity, her future. As she was led from the room, she looked back at Richard Branson. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out the window, his expression grim, as if contemplating the mess he now had to clean up. She hadn't just been an employee. She had been a poison in the system he had built, and he had just performed the painful but necessary act of cutting her out. The hard karma had hit. It wasn't a lightning bolt from the sky. It was a quiet, bureaucratic, and utterly devastating verdict delivered in a boardroom on a Tuesday morning. She had torn a man's ticket in half, and in return, the world had torn her life apart. David Henderson landed the Dubai Museum project. His presentation, fueled by a strange new mixture of adrenaline and purpose, was the best of his career. He spoke not just of steel and glass, but of building bridges between cultures, of creating spaces that welcomed everyone. The themes resonated more deeply with him now than ever before. Throughout his trip, he received daily updates from Richard Branson's executive assistant. They informed him of Caroline's termination and the airline's public apology, which named the incident without naming him, respecting his privacy. The airline also made a significant donation in his name to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But for David, the chapter didn't feel closed. A dismissal and a donation felt like patching a hole rather than reinforcing the foundation. The problem wasn't just one employee. It was a culture that could allow such an employee to fester for years. On his flight back to New York, seated once again in 1A, he spent the time not celebrating his victory, but drafting a proposal. When he landed at JFK, the same terminal where his ordeal had begun, he didn't call the complimentary car service Branson had arranged. He called the personal number on the business card. "Richard, it's David Henderson," he said when the billionaire answered. "David, welcome back to the States. I trust the rest of your trip was less eventful." Branson's voice was warm, friendly. "It was very successful, thank you. And thank you for everything you've done. But I think there's more to do." "I agree," Branson said immediately. "What's on your mind?" "Refunding my ticket and making a donation is a fine gesture," David began. "But it doesn't solve the underlying problem. You have a blind spot in your training. Your staff knows the rules, but some of them, like Caroline, don't understand the human principles behind them. They don't have the tools to recognize and dismantle their own biases. David took a breath. My firm specializes in designing systems and structures. Human systems are the most complex structures of all. I want to propose a partnership. Let my company, in conjunction with leading DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, work with you to design a new immersive training program for all your customer-facing staff. Not a one-hour webinar, but a real scenario-based curriculum. Let's build something better out of this. There was a moment of silence on the line. Then Branson let out a low whistle. David, I've been in business for over 50 years. In a situation like this, people usually ask for one of two things: a lifetime supply of free flights or a very large check. You're the first person who has ever asked for homework. David could hear the smile in his voice. You're offering to turn your pain into our progress. You want to help fix the system that failed you. We're all part of the system, David replied. If we don't fix it, we're just waiting for the next victim. Done, Branson said without hesitation. Consider your proposal accepted. My team will reach out to yours tomorrow to set up the initial meetings. We'll fund the entire project. This is the best idea I've heard all year. 3 months later, David Henderson stood on a stage in a Virgin Atlantic training facility near Heathrow. In front of him sat a class of 50 new flight attendant recruits. Their red uniforms were immaculate, their faces bright with aspiration. At the side of the stage stood Richard Branson. David was the keynote speaker for the inaugural session of the Henderson Protocol, a new empathy and situational awareness training program that was now mandatory for all Virgin employees. He told them his story. He spoke of the humiliation at the gate, the feeling of powerlessness, and the quiet dignity he fought to maintain. He didn't name Caroline, referring to her only as the employee. He didn't need to. Her story had become a cautionary tale whispered in every airline break room in the world. But he didn't dwell on the negative. He spoke about what service truly meant. He talked about seeing the individual, not the stereotype. He used his architectural background to frame it. Every passenger who steps onto your plane, he told them, is the foundation of our entire structure. If you treat even one of them as less than essential, the whole building becomes unstable. As he concluded his speech, the room of recruits rose to their feet in a heartfelt standing ovation. David saw in their eyes not just the ambition to see the world, but a genuine understanding of their responsibility to the people they would carry into it. Branson came up and shook his hand. You're a hell of an architect, David, he said, his voice full of admiration. But you might have missed your calling as a teacher. David smiled, looking out at the new generation of crew. The memory of the torn ticket would never fully fade, but it no longer felt like a wound. It was a blueprint. The original plan had been flawed, so he had ripped it up and, with an unlikely partner, designed something far stronger, far more beautiful, and far more human in its place. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a racist flight attendant getting what she deserved. It was a story about character. The character of a woman who let her prejudice shatter her own life, and the character of a man who, when faced with humiliation, chose to build rather than break. David Henderson could have taken a payout and walked away. But he chose the harder, better path. He used his voice to transform a moment of personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change, reminding us all that true strength isn't about winning a fight. It's about rewriting the rules so the fight never has to happen again. If this story of justice and positive change moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. What did you think of David's decision? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.